Hello, and welcome to And the Runner-Up Is. This week on the show, we'll travel back in time to the 43rd Academy Awards, which awarded the films of 1970. Robert Altman arrived with a controversial yet very welcome skeptical look at war with the Korean War set comedy MASH. The rowdy comedy was a major hit at the box office and won over critics, too, establishing Altman as a director to watch in the decades to come. When it came to the Oscars, it was nominated in 5 categories, including Best Picture, winning for its adapted screenplay, but it was another war film, Patton, that took Best Picture and 6 other categories on Oscar night. So why did the Academy choose one film about war over the other? We'll explore all this and more as we discuss how the Oscar almost went to MASH. Hello, and welcome back to And the Runner-Up Is. I am your host, Kevin Jacobson, and today I have another third-timer here joining the club. And you last heard him actually talking about this past year's Oscars, 91st Academy Awards, during our breakdown. He also was on a regular show for 1992, way back then for Howard's End. And then before that, you heard him on the Life of Pi episode 2012. So here he is again from Gold Derby, from Next Best Picture, all over the place, Mr. Tom O'Brien.
Hey, Kevin.
Hi.
Two more visits and I'll be able to get that coveted And the Runner-Up Is blazer.
Yes, the Five Timers Club.
Yes.
That will be very exciting. You are in a dead heat between you, Karen Peterson, and Zach Laws. So
all great guests.
Yes. So today we are wrapping up the 1970s, and in my context, that means the very first year of the 1970s, which is 1970. So interesting year. We have a few war films in the mix here, even also some not even nominated war films. And so let's talk about it. The runner-up we are talking about today is indeed MASH, which lost Best Picture to Patton. And so to get into a quick summary of MASH, it is a war comedy based on the 1968 novel MASH, a novel about 3 army doctors by Richard Hooker. It tells the story of the Mobile Army Surgical Hospital stationed in South Korea during the Korean War and all the colorful medical personnel who work there. And the story really begins with the arrival of Hawkeye Pierce and Duke Forrest, who like to stir up trouble and get into shenanigans when they're not also, treating injured soldiers. And the camp includes Major Frank Burns, who is a rather incompetent surgeon who has deeply held religious beliefs and kind of gets on his fellow servicemen's nerves. There's also Trapper John McIntyre, who gets into the pranking and womanizing and things with Hawkeye and Duke. And then there's Margaret Houlihan, who eventually gets the nickname Hot Lips. And she is the strict head nurse who is just trying to do her best among this group of very rowdy men. And so the film is essentially kind of a slice of life as we follow their various exploits as the Korean War just wages on around them. The film was directed by Robert Altman and written by Ring Lardner Jr. It stars Donald Sutherland as Hawkeye, Tom Skerritt as Duke, Elliot Gould as Trapper John, Sally Kellerman as Hot Lips, Robert Duvall as Frank Burns, and a whole host of others, including Roger Bowen, Renee Auberjonois, Gary Burghoff, Fred Williamson, Bud Cort, and many, many more. So MASH made $67 million at the box office, was one of the bigger hits of the year, was nominated for 5 Academy Awards, and won one of them, but that one was not, in fact, Best Picture. So, Tom, let us talk MASH. What is your relationship with MASH?
I remember seeing MASH, and I will confess, I saw it in college, and it was
Interesting time. Yeah.
yes, it was very interesting because I was going to school that was very anti-war, and MASH came out, and even though it was about Korea in quotes, everyone read it as being about Vietnam, and it exploded. At least on my campus, people said, "Have you seen it? Have you seen it?" And I had never seen a Robert Altman movie before, and it just knocked me for a loop. It's so different than any other film director approaching material, with overlapping sound and floating camera and overlapping dialogue, and you never knew you felt like you were plopped right in the middle of this particular hospital, and with what all the goings on there, some are fun, some are bloody, and it's a very challenging mix of the two. And I must say, I went back the very next week to see it a second time. And I've seen it many, many times since, but I haven't seen it in a long time until I just did it for this podcast. And it's interesting, the perspective of seeing that now rather than back then.
Yeah. By the way, I just noticed the MASH poster behind you. So
yeah,
you are clearly a fan.
It's a Polish poster, so it's not the American poster, but this was done by an artist.
Yeah, that looks very good. Not that anyone listening to this would see it, but regardless.
It's gorgeous.
Yes. So, MASH is an interesting one, looking at it through the lens of 2019. This is 49 years later. So I think it's a movie that really works in the context of where America was as a nation at that time and how we felt about the war at that time. You know, at the time, we were very much in the thick of the Vietnam War. And even though MASH does take place in the Korean War, I think that same general anti-war sentiment was creeping up quite a bit after the 60s. And in MASH, you have these guys, a lot of them were presumably drafted, young guys who are rebellious and immature and very young, and they like to play just these practical jokes and question authority, things like that. And so within that context, this is a movie that makes sense as far as why it became such a massive hit at the time, why it was so refreshing, and all of that. But I will say, watching it now, myself, it's not necessarily a movie that I enjoy. That is my honest take on MASH at this point. Like, I am divorced a lot from the context of when it came out, certainly, but I also think a lot of the humor is mean-spirited in an uncomfortable way at times for me. And I think in a lot of cases, the men, all of the very straight white men, that sort of thing, a lot of it feels like punching down in some ways to women, to homosexuals, things like that. And so I think this is definitely a movie that I respect a lot more than I genuinely enjoy as an experience. So I think we have some differing perspectives on this that could make this an interesting discussion.
But this will be fun.
Yes. I don't often disagree slightly with my guests on the films, so I would love to get into this. So first off, I just wanted to talk about how, a lot like a lot of the characters in the film, they don't have much care for formalities and following the rules, things like that. And I definitely think this is a film that itself feels very loose and doesn't have like this big overarching plot, even to the point that the climax involves like a football game that isn't really necessarily, there's nothing alluding to this going to eventually be about a football game, right? And so I think that looseness really makes sense with the text itself, with how the film is presented.
Well, it's interesting that this film got made at all, given the kinds of military films that America had been used to. It was written based on the Richard Hooker book. It was written by Ring Lardner Jr., who was one of the blacklisted writers and had been out of not out of work. He wrote under a pseudonym for years and finally got his name back in a 1965 film called The Cincinnati Kid. But he had read this book and wrote a script that came to Richard Zanuck at 20th Century Fox. And Zanuck liked it very, very much. And a production executive wanted to produce it, Ingo Preminger, Otto's brother. And this was his first and last production where he ever served as producer. So he came in and went out with a bang. But they couldn't find anybody who would agree to make it. Altman was the 15th director. 14 before had turned it down. And I just want to give a little background on it. There's been rumors for years. Was it given to Kubrick? Was it given to George Roy Hill? Other directors? Who knows? But they finally came to Altman, and he said, "We'll have some fun with it." Now, as to the question of how it ever got made, Fox had 2 other pictures, war pictures, in production at the very same time. There was Patton, which cost 6 times more than MASH's budget, and a picture called Tora, 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 which was 7 times the budget of MASH. And Altman was hired if he promised to keep the budget low. And that's the only reason they hired him. And complications ensued after that. So we can get to that at some point. But that's how the picture kind of got together, and it was all done. It was shot in the ranch, the Fox Ranch out in Malibu, where they used to do Westerns. And they just laid low. They didn't want to have the studio notice them at all. Keep under budget. Don't give interviews. We're just going to make this thing and see if we get away with it. And they did.
Right. And I feel like it's interesting that he was very much not like the first choice for this, because this really feels very distinctively like an Altman film. Obviously, it's really where a lot of people discovered Altman, of course, and he uses a lot of those same types of things in his films in the ensuing years for decades to come, including the ensemble nature of the cast. No one person is necessarily the lead, even though we kind of sort of have, Donald Sutherland and Tom Skerritt as de facto leads, but also they share a lot of screen time with a lot of other people. And also the overlapping dialogue, you're not sure who you should be really listening to. It's all very somewhat chaotic, but also in a controlled chaos in a way. And so, yeah, it's interesting that he really makes his mark on this, and it really influences what he will be doing for the rest of his career.
Yeah, he was nobody's first choice, which luckily meant that he was left alone.
Right. And I think that makes sense. That context makes it make total sense, honestly. And so I did want to explore what we think the overall takeaway from the film is, and what do we think of this as we are watching these guys who are going around pranking everyone and not necessarily listening to authority and doing all this stuff. Do we consider that to be like a likable trait, that we're just kind of following these guys and having fun with them? Or do you consider this more of a commentary on what war can do to people, kind of bring out the worst in them in some ways, things like that? Because there's been a lot of discussion of what exactly the film is trying to say with these characters.
I have always read it as the pranks and the jocularness of all of that is a way to keep their sanity, because the film mentions, several times that they often spend 12 to 14 hours a day cutting open soldiers who are brought in, and it's a steady flow. There's no rest time. They'll bring in another wounded person, and then you fix them up and then move on, and there's another one and another one and another one. And so I've always read the joking and the pranks as a way of keeping their mind straight. Because if they stop to think of all of the personal stories of the people they are working on, it could just drive you mad.
Right. That's fair. That's a good and that's a generous reading of the film. And I think that that is very much true. I also think that it can become so uncomfortable to a point that I am genuinely not enjoying these characters and their
Mhm.
antics whatsoever.
Yeah, I mean,
um,
are they doing that, or are they bullies?
right. That's kind of what it definitely verges to, especially in
Hmm.
that middle section.
Yes.
And I'm not necessarily saying that every protagonist should be a likable figure who you must relate to and they are this force of good in the world or anything like
Yeah.
that. It doesn't have to be this ideological purity test, anything like that. But at the same time, it gets to a point where I think a lot of what they do is a lot of the sequences feel slightly drawn out in a way that I feel like, okay, I get what's happening. It's
Hmm.
I don't know if the pacing really suits what the message ultimately is for me. Yeah, it might just be a different frequency that I'm not feeling with
Hmm.
the sensibility of the film. I don't know whether that's just my own kind of bias just looking at it now, or if there's some actual fault with the film, but there are parts of it that really just don't work for me. And that
Understood.
especially is including the very much rampant misogyny that's happening throughout the film and what they do to hot lips on
Hmm.
multiple occasions.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think there's three basic issues that we need to talk about. I think, well, first of all, we should tell people, if you've never seen the film, this is not the TV show.
Right.
The TV show is very different. It's funny, but comparatively antiseptic compared to what's
Yeah.
done
It's
here.
not quite as arch as this.
No, no.
Right, right.
But they take on, and looking at this now, and it was still true when I saw it in 1970. Uh, the treatment of women, the treatment of religion,
Hmm.
and the treatment of homosexuality.
Yeah.
And I think all three of these could be considered problematic areas uh, as we look at it today. Um, since you had mentioned the treatment of women, let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah.
Uh, because we focus on, I think probably the scene that many people remember is the humiliation of Hot Lips as the shower curtain comes up, and the entire men and women
Yeah, that's
in
true. They both participate in that.
they both participate in that, because it's not that she's a woman. She's, as what Hawkeye calls her in one scene, a regular army clown. And I think it's the rigidity that they fight against and not necessarily her gender. Now, they choose to do it in a very humiliating manner, but she and Frank Burns have tried to have them thrown out of the army earlier on. I mean, there's a bit of payback on this,
Yeah.
but and Frank Burns certainly gets his comeuppance, and now it's time for Hot Lips to do it. It's still an uncomfortable scene to watch.
Right.
I was listening to Altman's audio track when I watched it, and
Oh.
he had said the first time he saw it, Sally Kellerman was so nervous and very scared about people seeing her body, that as soon as the flap went up on the first take, she immediately hit the ground, and she said you can't tell what the moment is. So what Altman and Gary Berghoff did, one of the actors in the film, the one who plays Radar, is on the second take, the flap goes up, and Altman and Gary Berghoff drop their pants completely, so that when around the camera, so that when the flap came up, Kellerman saw their naked bodies, and there was a moment of shock before she hit the ground, and that's what they wanted. And Altman will humiliate himself to get a reaction that he really wants to get.
Yeah. That's something that definitely feels like it is very much of the 70s new Hollywood style of just kind of doing whatever it takes to get the shot.
But I like to take a moment to talk about the other women
Yeah. Okay.
in the film, because no one else really is humiliated in that way. When Duke and Hawkeye first arrive at the MASH camp, Duke clumsily tries to pick up this woman using the kind of manly macho techniques. And Hawkeye, and he calls her, yeah, no, you're quite a dish. And she raises her hand to display her wedding ring. And Hawkeye points that out to Duke and says, and extends his hand and says, "It's a pleasure to meet you, Lieutenant Dish." And she smiles and walks away. There's a certain respect there between the two of them. And of the other women too, they're one of the guys. It's only when someone comes in this case it happens to be a woman, who tries to disrupt that, I think that the misogyny comes out.
Right. And I believe this is probably a good transition to the other problematic, quote unquote, portion of the film, which involves the dentist, the Painless, who has an awkward encounter with a woman. He can't get it up, to put it crassly. And yeah, and so he finds a lot of shame in this. So obviously he goes to Hawkeye and kind of confesses this and thinks he might be a homosexual because he can't engage sexually with a woman at this point. And, Hawkeye does end up explaining, like, this happens to men all the time. This is very normal. But the dentist is very convinced. And so they pull off this elaborate thing after he says that he just wants to commit suicide because of this, where they basically make it seem like they are assisting in the suicide, essentially, because suicide is painless. So it doesn't end up actually being that. They don't actually give him like lethal pills or anything, but he enlists in, I believe it is Lieutenant Dish, right?
It is indeed. On her last night in the base before she flies out.
Right. To sleep with him. I mean, I really found a lot of this particular scene to be drawn out and slightly uncomfortable. Basically linking the idea that you might be gay to I should probably just commit suicide. And a lot of that is gay panic, which is prevalent in this period of time, especially in the 50s. But it's still just the way that it all goes down.
That's an interesting take on it, because I'm a gay man, but I wasn't out when I first saw the film, and I didn't think much about it. But I approached it again, kind of concerned about that. You're thinking, okay, is this as the way I remember it? And I found that Painless is a bit ignorant in terms of sexuality, and he immediately equates impotence with being gay. If I can't get it up for a woman, and he makes it clear he's never had any feelings towards men, and he's never, he says at one point, well, I guess it's just a matter of time. I took that as more ignorance than homophobia.
Yeah.
And and the suicide, I don't think was because of the gay stuff. I think it's because of the erectile dysfunction. I think that is the reason why if he can't function, because he's the painless pole, what's there left to live for? And I wasn't as offended by it as I thought I was going to be. But it may be I just like the film. I'm trying to find an excuse to get on it. But I did find it fine and sympathetic, and I just thought Painless was just ignorant about the causes of erectile dysfunction, and he just made a mistake.
Yeah, I would say that there's probably a mix of both. That him being ignorant, which is what leads everyone to kind of pick on him almost, and also that latent homophobia that we can't really ignore at this period of time.
Sure. I mean, and you've got a whole lot of, all the men in it are straight.
Yeah.
Or at least nobody's openly out. But we have to remember this is the early 1950s.
Yeah, which is a particularly bad time. Yeah.
Yeah, in a male situation, it would be very dangerous to be out.
Right.
So, and it may have been perceived as more of a shame back then than it is now.
Right.
So.
And everything you're saying, a lot of this definitely makes sense for, again, the time. I think intellectually I can appreciate all of that. It's just the feeling of watching it is kind of unsettling more often than not. Yeah. So one thing that some people have criticized about MASH is the ending football scene. Some people say it might go on too long. Some people say this doesn't feel like the right climax. Oddly enough, I kind of enjoyed this portion because, first of all, I think it's the most overtly humorous, laugh out loud part of the film. And I also think it does serve to function kind of a general thesis of the film, which is kind of the folly of war and things like that, of just having essentially the climax be about two people from more or less the same side who are, just going at it for fruitless reasons, essentially.
And two coaches or leaders who are just there for their own egos and, of course, to pocket some cash.
Right, exactly. So I like that it serves as a kind of metaphor for everything that's going on around them. And I just think it's very funny, even though I will say I think the characterization of Hot Lips here is a little incongruous with the rest of the film.
It's one of the things I'm not crazy about in the film. I think we're missing a scene or two.
Yeah.
Because the last time we see her before she comes out and is all rah rah gung ho cheerleader, I think she's sneaking out of the back of the swamp tent with Duke. And it's like, now is she okay because Duke is sleeping with her? It was never fully explained to me.
Yeah.
Kellerman makes it work, but if you stop and think about it, it's just too much of a leap.
Right. Yeah. It definitely feels like there's a scene missing here.
Yeah.
And
nonetheless, she's hilarious.
Yes.
In cheerleading scenes.
Even though it's just like totally absurd, I just love the moment where the ref shoots off a gun and she just goes, "They've shot him." I love that. She really sells a lot of the film, and I think her Oscar nomination here is a warranted one. I think she is very good in the film. I also think she is very much benefited by the fact that she is pretty much the only woman in the film with a prominence. So I think, a lot of the other actors are male. And so I think a lot of them split the votes. You don't know if they're lead or supporting, things like that.
True. It is interesting. You look at the credits and there are 14 people in it who are listed as introducing. Because what Altman did when he cast the film, he was basically, the studio said, we want Donald Sutherland and Elliot Gould. And he said, okay. He wanted Elliot Gould for Duke originally. And Gould says, I feel much more like a Trapper. So he got Trapper. So he was looking for someone to play Duke. And by coincidence, an old TV actor who he was just calling to talk about him, just to say hi, called Tom Skerritt, and Altman said he's perfect for it, and he was. It's interesting, but everybody else, Altman went up to San Francisco to an improv troupe and recruited almost everybody else from that particular troupe because he knew he wanted to have a lot of improvisation on the set, and boy, did he ever. As far as Hot Lips goes, she was initially written as an older woman, and Altman knew what he wanted, and he knew the actress he wanted, Elaine Stritch. That would have made a very different film. I
would have liked to have seen that interpretation of it.
If only there was screen tests of that.
Yeah.
I'd love to see it. But as soon as Kellerman walked in, Altman knew, and he said, I will rewrite everything in order to accommodate you in this.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Are there any other cast members here that you find to be standouts?
Well, it's so interesting that there's a number of people who have gone on to really good movie careers. Certainly, Rene Auberjonois has been in a number of things. McCabe and Mrs. Miller's with Altman, and then he was on Benson, I believe, for years on TV. Michael Murphy has been in a lot of things, particularly a lot of Woody Allen films, and as well as Altman films. Bud Cort had the huge success with Harold and Maude.
Yes.
And Fred Williamson, I think he's still making movies. He got his own kind of slightly comic, slightly violent blaxploitation films in the late 70s. And he's an auteur, and he does everything his way, the way Altman would. So, yeah. I mean, it is interesting to see how well a lot of these people who were plunked from obscurity have made out. Very astute casting.
Yeah. And we once again have Robert Duvall popping up in another 70s movie here. I think he plays it really straight, compared to a lot of the other people who are very outlandish at times.
Yes.
But I think it definitely works for the character, the devoutly religious, very serious-minded character.
Yeah.
So, another great Robert Duvall performance here.
Yet another.
Yep. Yeah.
But let's talk about religion, because I mean that's another thing the film has been criticized about, that it's anti-religion, and certainly there's some blasphemous things in it, particularly the final supper or last supper of Painless, in which they recreate the Da Vinci painting. Whose idea was that? But it's great. It's terrific. But people have read that as being anti-religion. And also the Duvall character, they feel, he's made a mockery of. But I don't know. I think it's as much for his hypocrisy as it is for his faith. Certainly allowing poor Bud Cort, when a patient dies, to blame it on him for a mistake that Frank himself had made. Certainly strikes as someone who is not exactly Christian, right, in the most giving or loving or understanding sense. But for those who, there is the character of Dago Red, the minister on duty, the priest on duty at the base. And he's a wonderfully sympathetic character. He has real faith, and he clings to the church, but he doesn't do it at the expense of human beings. He is there to help. My door is open, please come in. And he's never made fun of. He's funny, but he is never the object of derision.
Right. Like, I love the moment at the end. It is him, right? That it's basically blessing the Jeep.
Yes. And apparently that's a real prayer.
I love that.
Yeah.
Well, that's that aspect of things I definitely did find less issue with, because like you were saying, I do think his character is presented as a bit of a hypocrite. And so you kind of understand why they would want to get back at him for things. But I did remember reading that, like, this was more or less one of the first, if not the first, super like mainstream American films to actually be anti-religious in some ways.
Yes, or at least, let's say giving it a skeptical eye.
Right.
About
more skeptical, right.
The hypocrisy of some so-called believers.
Right. So that's yet another confrontational thing about this movie. I think that I think a lot of people at the time certainly appreciated.
Yes. The other thing that the studio was very scared that would put people off would be the amount of blood in the operating scenes, which from all accounts, is fairly realistic. It was particularly in that time, in that setting, in a makeshift rat trap hospital. They're just going to do what they can. These guys are brought in, and it's a mess. But I learned that there was a person on set. There was a real surgeon who is in the film throughout, and he has his back to us through most of the film, and he's the one who actually supervises all of the actors to do things in the right way.
Oh, okay.
Apparently, it's very sound.
Right.
In with that. And I also like the fact that you see the weariness and the exhaustion when they get off their shift. It's a drain, not just physically, but really mentally.
Right.
Of the lives they have saved or could not do it.
Yeah. And all of those sequences that are very graphic and showing the blood, I think they do also hammer home the idea of kind of the cost of war in many ways.
Yes, so. Yeah, which we need to be reminded of in this film.
Absolutely,
and just a few miles away. But ironically, when the first cut was shown to Fox, they said those operating scenes have got to go, and Altman put his foot down and said, "Without those, we don't have a picture. Otherwise, it's just a big joke book."
Yeah, that's a good point. I feel like if those were not there, I would feel even more like this all just feels like a super juvenile thing that isn't really having much of a point and feels kind of awkward and mean-spirited in many ways. I do think that it does contextualize who these people are, in a good way.
Yeah, they're not just clowns.
Right.
They're accomplished doctors.
Yeah.
This was one of those times when the studio actually backed Altman. Apparently, about a third of the way into the picture, and all parties admit that this happened, Donald Sutherland and Elliot Gould went to their agents, who then went to Fox and demanded that Altman be fired. He said they don't like working with this guy. They don't know what the hell he's doing. And although from Altman's point of view, it's like they were mad that they were the stars of the film, and Altman was spending more time with the ensemble than he was with them. And but they eventually got it, and Sutherland and Gould became one of Altman's biggest cheerleaders, and Gould went on to have great performances in later Altman films as well.
Yeah, I believe this was the only time he worked with Donald Sutherland, though. So
yes, yeah, I think that Donald Sutherland was one and done.
Yeah, right. Well, speaking of Donald Sutherland, we actually got a question that I think we could cover here from Claudio Alves, saying MASH marks the first of Donald Sutherland's many Oscar snubs. Why do you think this respected and beloved actor has never gotten a nomination despite his good work in many Oscar-winning productions? Also, for which films would you have nominated him?
Wow. That's that. Well, obviously, Ordinary People.
Ordinary People, I feel like, yeah, he should have contended for the win. He wouldn't have won with Robert De Niro as in Raging Bull in the mix, but still.
No. But, I know that you saw the film again when you got to 1980 on the show.
Yeah.
And the subtle work he does in that is so good. The first time you look at it, you wind up being drawn to Mary Tyler Moore because it's so different. And you don't notice him as much. And I'm wondering whether that's what happened. Because the second time I watched Sutherland, and my God, what he does in that is so good.
Right, yeah. He's amazing in Ordinary People. And I remember, I think, talking in that episode about how he had made a few comments here and there about like the Academy and people in Hollywood. He was more of a New York-based actor, I think, at the time. So he didn't necessarily feel a part of that crowd. So I think that might be part of it. Just he didn't really have the connections, even though he worked on so many great productions, obviously.
Yes.
It just... Yeah.
But a lot of it is playing the game.
Yep. Yeah. Some people don't like playing the game. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but I'm so happy he at least has an honorary Oscar.
Right. Yeah. At least he has that.
Yeah.
It's not quite on the same level as a competitive Oscar for many people, but it's still after a lifetime of incredible work in indie movies, in Oscar-winning films, in blockbusters. Like he is really a versatile actor who I'm glad continues to get work to this day. Yeah.
Oh, well, thank you for the question. That's a good one.
We actually did get a few other questions relating to MASH, even though we already kind of covered them, both from Amy Thomason and from Joey Gentili, both wanting us to talk about essentially how we feel about this film, in the context of today, in an era of Me Too, also in an era of, wanting to acknowledge sort of homophobic things in film. I think we kind of covered both of those in a way. I don't know if you had any differing feelings having watched it then and watching it now. I don't know if anything has changed for you, maybe.
I remember seeing Amy's question about the Me Too movement in particular, and so when I approached it with some trepidation because of that, but I've made a point of focusing on how the women were treated here, and I think by and large, given the fact it's a period piece, they come off pretty well, except for Hot Lips. And I don't necessarily think it was because of her gender, but yeah, I wish there's no focus on any woman except her,
Right.
and that's the story they told back then. So I think there's another MASH story to be told if you just focused on the female characters.
Sure.
Why are they there? Did they enlist? Were they drafted? The film never has time to really get into that, and but the characters and the actors are strong enough. The women are strong enough to invite those kind of questions.
Yeah, and I actually do think that story would be interesting. Having these women in a male-dominated world, having to balance a lot of different things. And so, yeah, I would like to see that. But did you have any other thoughts on MASH before we move on to why it loses to another war movie?
It was one of the, I think this is one of the key movies of the era that was a huge hit from a major studio that was so anarchic. It, I think, paved the way for a lot of the films, especially in the early 70s, 72, 73, 74. Studios saw that they could make money with counterculture movies. I hate to call this that, but one where the humor is more rude, the sex and the blood are perhaps more explicit. And it wound up, I think, but it was palatable because it was a comedy. And I think it wound up being one of those films that changed other studios' minds as what constitutes a good commercial movie.
Yeah. And I do respect a lot of things about it. I've already covered how I personally just maybe not enjoying it on a personal level for much of it, but I respect that it has certainly had a lot of influence. It obviously became a TV show that became one of the most popular shows of all time, which was different in its tone and things like that, and had a whole other cast of actors as these characters. But also, I think definitely influenced some of the raucous comedies that we would see in the years to come, especially in the 80s, things like that. So it has its place in history. It's fine. It doesn't need my approval.
Well, I think we agree to disagree very, very civilly.
Yes, good. Okay, good discussion. So when we come back, we will be discussing why MASH lost Best Picture to Patton.
MASH, a motion picture that raises some important moral questions. And then it drops them.
What are you two hoodlums doing in this hospital?
Well, what's the matter with her today?
Look, Mother, I want to go to work in 1 hour. We are the pros from Dover.
Somebody get that dirty old man out of this operating theater.
And then give me at least one nurse who knows how to work in close without getting her tits in my way.
I wonder how a degenerated person like that could have reached a position of responsibility in the Army Medical Corps.
He was drafted.
Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come.
His will be done. Oh, Frank, my lips are hot. Oh, kiss my hot lips.
We have got to share this with the rest of us.
Frank. Oh.
What the hell is that?
Oh, Frank. Wait a second.
What is it?
Turn the light off. No, that door.
I should check with the military vicar's office. You see, I cannot give absolution to a man who is about to commit suicide.
Do you have any particular method that you'd recommend?
Black capsule.
Black capsule.
Suicide is painless. It brings on many changes.
This isn't a hospital. It's an insane asylum. My God, they've shot him.
Hot lips, you incredible nincompoop. It's the end of the quarter.
And we're back. So now we will be talking about why MASH lost Best Picture to Patton. MASH was nominated for 5 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, Best Director for Robert Altman, Best Supporting Actress for Sally Kellerman, Best Adapted Screenplay, and Best Film Editing, and it won Best Adapted Screenplay.
And even though Ring Lardner hated the movie.
Yes, there was some friction there, and he didn't even mention Robert Altman in his speech.
No. Ironically, the one Oscar it wins.
Right.
But Altman has never badmouthed Ring Lardner at all. Mm-hmm. He said we could not have done this movie without the outline that he gave us.
Yeah.
So for Altman, that's gracious.
Right. And before the Oscars, MASH won the Golden Globe for Best Picture, Comedy or Musical, and the WGA. And then Patton won the DGA, the WGA, and the National Board of Review Best Picture. So both were kind of going into the race with some precursors behind them. Love Story had also won the Golden Globe for Best Drama, which in addition to like a whole bunch of other Golden Globes that it won, like Director, Screenplay even, and Ally McGraw for Best Actress. So really 3 movies here, I think, were in contention for the win at this point.
Yeah.
But we are here to talk about MASH and why that was... First of all, I definitely want to talk about why that was the runner-up compared to Love Story. Because you have made your case as to why you thought MASH was clearly more ahead than Love Story was.
Setting aside our usual Oscar thing, MASH did win a key screenplay Oscar. And it was nominated for, in 5 categories, picture director, an acting nomination, a screenplay win, and an editing nomination. Those are the key categories for, and it shows for a Best Picture nomination. I thought it showed a strength across the board.
Yeah.
And more than Love Story did in terms of actual wins. But Love Story was a phenomenon at the time and during the voting. So that's right now, people don't think of it all that often, I don't think. But at the time, boy, oh boy, everybody went to see Love Story.
Yeah. Well, I think one thing about this is that MASH was certainly loved by critics. Love Story was not as much by any means. Neither was Airport, another Best Picture nominee here. But I just think looking at the 2 of them, it's one of these things where instinctively, I feel like a movie like MASH, especially in 1970, the year after they award Best Picture to Midnight Cowboy, MASH just feels a lot more aligned to the 70s than Love Story. And I don't know that anyone would say, even if it did become this phenomenon, that Love Story is a great cinematic achievement.
No. It did what it did. It made people happy. God love you.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing about this, and I think this may be unique among our Best Picture runner-up and winners discussions, is these are two military films with two very different points of view. And coming as they did in the height of the Vietnam War, the films were casually labeled as pro-war and anti-war. You depended on I don't know about the voting, but I can imagine that your feeling about the war may have influenced what film you voted for. And in that sense, I think Patton gets a bad rap because it's not gung-ho, rah-rah,
right,
as often as it's dismissed.
Yeah.
And but it did create a very interesting discussion apart from the qualities of the films about their relevance in terms of the larger picture of the Vietnam War at the time.
Mm-hmm.
So younger people tended to gravitate towards MASH. Older Academy voters tended to gravitate towards Patton.
Yeah.
And
I think it's pretty logical why Patton is the winner over MASH. It certainly has a lot of the great formal elements to it that make it this epic achievement. Mm-hmm. It's like almost 3 hours long. It's has this really great central performance by George C. Scott, playing a really fascinating figure who some people can find admirable. Some people can think this guy was a total raving lunatic. It was just like, so devoted to the cause beyond anything, really. And so, yeah, I just think it makes sense that Patton wins because it can give you a different reading depending on who you are, I think, because I definitely don't think it's totally just pro-war by any means. No. And so I think it's an interesting character study, even looking beyond the war aspect of it.
Yes, I think a lot of that has to do with the script by Edmund North and Francis Ford Coppola. Mm-hmm. Coppola has shown such nuance in his films going forward from this time that I can't help but think that a lot of that character reaction, ambiguity, whatever you want to call it, complexity comes from him. Mm-hmm. And I think that's, if you can separate it from its take on war, I think it's a fascinating character study and a film that I think is underrated, oddly enough, even though it won Best Picture, because no one talks about Patton anymore. And it's a good film and a worthy winner. You can see why, because it has the weight, the gravitas that people, even to this day, tend to associate with the Best Picture winner.
Right. And it's really the only one of these 5 nominees that has all of those elements that the Academy loves. So it makes total sense why they would gravitate towards this. And I do think, I agree. I think it is underrated. I think people kind of look at it on the surface for what it is and even compare it to MASH and being like, oh, well, it's just this rah-rah patriotism sort of movie about an old war general, and that's just what they love. But also, it has value at the same time. Like, it's not, it doesn't have to be this cynical sort of thing. So I like Patton. I think it's a very well-made movie.
I agree completely.
Yeah.
And a worthy winner.
Yeah. If you had any other discussion about Patton versus MASH, I would just wrap it up by saying I feel like the characters in MASH, a lot of these young guys kind of pulling pranks on each other, I don't know if that has the same amount of appeal to an older Academy than what Patton is doing. So, I just feel like on the surface, they can at least recognize something as more weighty, with more gravitas in Patton than anything that's happening in MASH.
The Academy could say, yes, we picked the right one, the honorable one, the one that reflects well upon Hollywood.
Right. There you go. Love Story. Oh boy. So Love Story comes out in December. It's this big Christmas weepy. I feel like it really is a movie that has influenced a lot of movies of this kind, of the Nicholas Sparks kind, you could say, the John Green kind of today's generation. It's just a classic, very sentimental, unironic, play to emotion for your audience.
Yep.
Make them cry, damn it.
Yes. It did. It made audiences cry. I remember you couldn't get near Love Story the first week. The lines were around the block. Now, you have to understand that these were the days before movies opening in 4,000 theaters at the same time. Love Story played out very slowly, just big cities and then spread out. But it was a phenomenon. And of course, it got huge support from the Globes, which I think helped to propel it into this race. And the influence, you're right, it's still going on. I mean, the current film, 5 Feet Apart, owes a lot to Love Story.
Yeah, absolutely.
You concentrate on young love and fatal illness, and hey, it works.
You have magic.
Yes.
We did get a question from Amy Thomason, another question from Amy Thomason, asking, why was Love Story up for any awards? It's such a ridiculous movie.
Well, it's at the time it was really a huge hit and was good enough. It may not look so hot now, but back then it was deemed to be good enough. The Golden Globes gave it that boost, and that's enough to get it in the conversation. It did come at the expense of, I think, some better films, but it was there. It was a factor, and even though it didn't win, it's a film that defines a lot of the 1970s season.
Yeah. I'm not going to compare it in quality to these films, but I will say it is a similar situation to something like The Exorcist or Star Wars, or even I would go so far as to say Black Panther all these years later, where a movie just becomes a cultural phenomenon and it becomes too big to ignore, essentially.
Yeah. If a Love Story didn't get in there then, there would have been a huge outcry.
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. And especially in an era where the Academy, I think, wanted to acknowledge movies that made an impact on general audiences more so than today, even though we are certainly seeing like the discussions within the Academy of being like, how do we broaden our audience again? Like, how do we get the people to watch? Maybe we should create a popular film category, things like that. I think the Academy now is quite different from what the Academy was then in terms of wanting to just, pick. The Academy now, I think, is definitely more focused on just finding the films that we like, the Academy we like, rather than necessarily what the actual American movie-going audience likes.
Yeah, and two back, and in that era too, the studios had a lot of sway and a lot of clout. Witness the nominations of Dr. Dolittle and Hello Dolly for Best Picture, and Airport is along those lines. I mean, Universal really banged the drum for this, and it got 10 nominations, and it was an enormous hit back in that day. I mean, it made $100 million back in 1970, which I think adjusted would be over $500 million today. It was just the kind of picture that played regularly, but it was just filled with stars and people couldn't miss it.
Yep.
But I think it was one of the last gasps of that kind of film in the Best Picture race, thankfully.
Well, we did see it with The Towering Inferno a few years later, to be fair.
Yeah, that was the straw that broke it.
That was the proper last gasp. Yeah. But yeah, this is definitely one of those all-star disaster films that we've been talking about the past few weeks on the show, like Poseidon Adventure, Earthquake, Towering Inferno. Airport is really, I mean, I had said that the Poseidon Adventure kind of helped kick things off a bit in that regard, but I think Airport certainly was probably the proper one to prove to Hollywood and, you know, the executives that this is a kind of movie the American public eats up.
Yeah.
And so
God help us all.
yes. All-star cast, Burt Lancaster, I mean, Dean Martin, Jacqueline Bisset, George Kennedy, Helen Hayes, who wins an Oscar for this.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think of this Helen Hayes performance winning Best Supporting Actress?
I don't think it's aged well. I was surprised at the time. I mean, certainly, the cutesy grandmotherly stowaway it's a twinkle in her eye, and but she's Helen Hayes, the first lady of the American theater, and maybe they were cowed into giving it to her for that, because there's some, besides Kellerman, there was Karen Black in 5 Easy Pieces, who gives a tremendous kind of star-making performance in that. And that's, I think, today, that would be the kind of performance that would win.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, looking at the Helen Hayes performance, yeah, I think it's one of these things where we just love this charming old lady. Honestly, if it was made today, it would probably just be like Judi Dench playing this role. And she would just have her cute little quips and be charming and then somehow win an Oscar for it. So, I mean, I feel like that's good casting, whatever. But I agree. Karen Black is wonderful in 5 Easy Pieces. Speaking to that movie, I think that would probably be my preferred Best Picture of this entire lineup, 5 Easy Pieces. It's, and I think it's very much of the new school of the Academy that brought that one in.
Yeah.
It only gets 4 nominations, but Best Picture is one of them. And I think it's a marvelous Jack Nicholson performance.
It's fascinating how he carries the film. And until that time, we just knew him for Easy Rider, having this plum supporting part. Can he really carry a film? And boy, he never looked back after 5 Easy Pieces.
Yeah.
It's a great performance, and he and Black have such wonderful chemistry together. And I think Critics Awards helped raise its profile enough. I'm very glad it got into the final 5. Mm-hmm. And I think it would have done a lot. That kind of film would do a lot better today than it did back in the Airport days.
Yeah, that's really, I've seen it a few times now, and it really reminded me on this past watch of the kind of movie that would absolutely soar with today's Academy.
Yeah,
it's this really rootable underdog indie drama, that sort of thing, with really great performances and really, complicated relationships, both between Jack Nicholson and Karen Black, and the relationship he has to his family, both really fascinating. And I love it. I think Karen Black is beyond great in this movie. I think she just goes there emotionally and is just not afraid to forego any sense of trying to look pretty for the camera or things like that. She is just balls out, just going there as a performer emotionally. It's just such a fragile performance that she sells so well.
Yeah.
And we got a few questions about 5 Easy Pieces. Another one from Amy Thomason. How about that?
I love you, Amy.
She was fired up about this year. She asked, do you agree with Scott winning over Nicholson? I've always thought Nicholson was robbed.
I know knocking Nicholson, but the complexity that Scott brings to Patton, what could have been a real one-note performance, he does it. It's in the writing, but I think he brings that gravitas to the role and the authority to the role. You have to believe that Patton could terrify these soldiers, and you thoroughly believe it with Scott. Nicholson's performance is completely the opposite, equal in quality, but very subtle and very complex in a different way. You're as the film progresses, you're still trying to understand the character. Where are his boundaries? What are his desires? What does he want? And I think that had he won for this, he might not have won for some of the other things that would come along quickly, and as good, if not better, performances.
Yeah. To this, I would say Jack Nicholson has 3 Oscars. So, I mean, he would be very well taken care of by that point in his career. And so I'm okay with George C. Scott winning this, because I do agree that it is a very deceptively complex performance. I almost wonder if this kind of a race was happening now. I feel like Twitter would be very much on the side of Jack Nicholson here. Like, it reminds me of one of these things where, like, a Gary Oldman versus Timothée Chalamet sort of thing. Like, we have this old veteran in a very showy performance, and then this young, edgy, rebellious upstart person who you're kind of rooting for as the underdog, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Is that crazy? I don't know.
No. But the Academy still, subtlety has not always been something that they give nominations to. I mean, I talk about the subtle work this year of Ethan Hawke in First Reformed, won more critics awards than any performance of male performance in that category, and never got nominated. So when you go the subtle route, you take your chances.
Yeah, exactly. And it's very rare. I mean, the only one in recent years in Best Actor that you could really say is super subtle would be Casey Affleck for Manchester by the Sea, which is almost similar to what Jack Nicholson is doing, kind of grappling with his past.
Yeah, and with family and the like. Yeah. That's a good comparison.
Yeah. Well, going to Karen Black, we got a question from Kyle Bailey, who asked us, do you think Karen Black is lead or supporting? I found her more of a lead.
Boy, that's a borderline, another borderline one. We have all kinds of borderline ones in this decade, from Tatum O'Neal to Louise Fletcher. Where do they belong? And she's a lead. I can see the argument for that, but I also can see why they placed her in supporting. It's not her story. That's
the thing for me that makes me feel like she was fine being in supporting actress. I mean, she gets maybe a little more screen time than a lot of supporting actress performances, but yeah, it's not her story. Even if she is the female lead, quote unquote, I feel like it's just not quite on that level. And also, let's be honest, she would have a better chance winning in supporting actress than she probably would in lead actress, which is in quotes filled with presumably performances that have a lot of screen time. In this particular year, that's not necessarily the case, but like Glenda Jackson winning for Women in Love, that's not totally a dominating lead performance there, is what I'm saying.
No, it's not in the way that best actresses very often are. It's all about them. It's not all about the character Gudrun and Women in Love.
Right.
And that was a win that was the kind of performance that I hadn't seen very much of winning in the past. So when she won, I was absolutely thrilled, because I do think it's the best female performance of the year. But I was surprised that they actually won for it.
Yeah, that feels like a real critics pick that goes on to actually win the Oscar, which is not too common ultimately. But yeah, I think Glenda Jackson is really good in Women in Love, even though it might be a borderline performance. She really goes there, both physically and emotionally. And she's Glenda Jackson. She's a powerhouse. I mean, what can you say?
Well, it's interesting. She wasn't Glenda Jackson then.
Right.
She was another English actress. And all of a sudden, this boldness comes with her. Talk about a powerful female character. Gudrun just rolls over Oliver Reed in this picture. Big, tough Oliver Reed doesn't have a chance against Glenda Jackson.
I love it. Yeah. So, well, just to wrap up with Karen Black, I had my own question for you about why we think Karen Black ends up losing this Oscar, because she wins the Golden Globe in a tie with Maureen Stapleton. But I really feel like from this lineup, she is very clearly the standout, Karen Black. Do you think her loss here is having to do with maybe some of the Academy not really welcoming her into the club, or not feeling comfortable with it, or why do you think there was a disconnect there?
I don't think it's personal. I think that the Helen Hayes win, particularly since Maureen Stapleton, her co-star, was the one who won the Golden Globe, was sentiment. It was career. She had won, but she had won 38 years before. So that most of the voters were not voters back then. I just thought it was entirely sentimental. And Karen Black, even though she became a name, as the 70s progressed, was not really that well known in a film that only got 4 nominations compared to Airport's 10.
Yeah.
So there was a broad level of support among various branches for Airport. So I think that's a combination of those things.
Yeah. Just to me, looking at that race, it really feels like an older Academy voting for an old favorite, who I will say is charming and funny in Airport. So it's not like totally absurd to me. But at the same time, when you have a performance like Karen Black's, I just feel like that's a missed opportunity. Even if she was young, even though she was not that experienced at the time, I think it's just one of those revelation types of performances that should have been acknowledged. But
yes,
that's how I feel. Any other questions here from these Best Picture nominees? No, but I will just say about this lineup. I have said that a lot of Best Picture lineups from the 70s were really great, with a few exceptions. I will say this is not by any means my favorite Best Picture lineup. I mean, this is where we're ending with the 70s, going backwards in time, obviously, and I cannot say that we saved the best for last here. No offense, Tom, but
But I'd like to say that this is where the 70s started.
Right.
And pictures like 5 Easy Pieces could get into the Best Picture race. And you can have this battle of cultures between Patton and MASH. It's not like the years that immediately follow, where you have Cabaret against The Godfather. Huge important films. But it's an interesting odd year, and one that very much reflected not only the politics of the times, but the beginnings of the changes in the Academy.
Yeah. I think this is a lineup, even though it's definitely not my favorite, is one that I can look at from a sociological standpoint. And that is part of why I have interest in the Oscars, is what it means about how we are as a society, what we value at the time, whether things age or are timeless. And I think this is a Best Picture lineup that has a lot of those different elements to it. So let's move on to our Should Have Been a Contender segment, and that's other Oscar nominees not nominated for Best Picture or any old movie that came out in 1970. So, Tom, let's talk.
I think if it was beyond 5 nominees, I think Women in Love would have gotten in.
Yes.
With an acting award and a screenplay award. And the interesting things I find about the screenplay is that most people don't know that the nominated screenplay for Women in Love was adapted by Larry Kramer, the AIDS activist who became a huge household name a decade and a half later, and to this day is still doing important work. And and people really don't know about his Hollywood career, but he's a damn good writer. From his play, The Normal Heart, from his books, that he's got the stuff, and he brought such a sexual tone to this. Granted, it's deep, but it's it's in the book, but it's Kramer helped to make it live. So I was very happy with that nomination.
Yeah, I really like Women in Love. I think Glenda Jackson, like I said, is fantastic. The wrestling scene in the movie is quite shocking for the time.
Certainly, yeah.
Between two men, and it becomes very homoerotic, and they start to explore some interesting territory there. The whole movie really is very much exploring interesting territory as far as sexuality, and they have these crazy montages that are just nudity, anything goes, really. And so
Glenda Jackson coming to ecstasy, running with the bulls, and a very interesting characterization from Alan Bates, who is rather sexually ambiguous in this.
Yeah,
and fascinating, and it really explores sex in a way that few pictures of this period did. Even though the standards were loosening a little bit, boy, Women in Love went for it. And I can't help but think that there were enough big fans for it, as if we were doing the current system, that this would have gotten into the final 6 or 7.
Yeah, this is absolutely a number 6. I mean, it's a really funny situation here because I just talked about Sunday Bloody Sunday last week, which also stars Glenda Jackson, also explores sexuality in an interesting way, especially bisexuality, homosexuality. And they both are in a position where they are probably the number 6 of this lineup. Yeah. Because they both get into Best Director as well. So, yeah, excellent Ken Russell movie. I'm glad that the Academy could embrace a movie of this nature, because I feel like this is kind of unheard of before the 70s, that a movie like this could be so acknowledged at all.
Yeah, at all.
Yeah. But we did get an interesting question from Claudio Alves, who asked, despite being released in the US in 1970, Women in Love is a 1969 film. If it had competed in the 1969 Oscars, do you think Jackson still would have won? And which of the other 1970 Best Actress nominees would have won instead of her?
Well, that's a good question. I don't think so. I don't think Jackson would have won. I do believe the winner that year was that Maggie Smith.
Yeah.
It's kind of the Karen Black problem. Maggie Smith was a more known star than Glenda Jackson would be at the time. Maybe they both would cancel each other out. I don't know. The dynamics of this are something, but I think it would have been more difficult for Jackson had it been released in 69.
Yeah, I don't think she would have won in 69. I think Maggie Smith probably wins that. That also has Jane Fonda, Liza Minnelli, a lot of big powerhouses kind of in their prime. As far as who would win in 1970 if Glenda Jackson weren't there, would it be crazy to say maybe Ally McGraw wins this?
No, it wouldn't be crazy. I mean, given the other folks, and the fact that Love Story had more support across the board than the films that any of the other nominees were in, it wouldn't be crazy.
Yeah.
But because Jane Alexander's in The Great White Hope, she won the Tony for this, but I believe in supporting. It's really a supporting role. Again, it's not her story, and the fact that she was bumped up to actress here was unfortunate, because I think she would have been very competitive in supporting actress. Sarah Miles and Ryan's Daughter, she's good in it, but the movie's not so hot. And Carrie Snodgrass in Diary of a Mad Housewife, that was a kind of one and done with Carrie Snodgrass. I mean, she really didn't have much of a career after that, but she's very good in the film. But none of them had, I think, the oomph that Ally McGraw would have brought to the race if without Glenda Jackson in it.
Right. And also, Love Story was just coming out in December. It's not too long after the hype of Love Story, I feel like, is still happening at this time. And yeah.
And she had the Globe under her belt.
Yeah, she won the Golden Globe for Best Actress in a Drama. So I believe that was over Glenda Jackson too.
Yeah.
So I definitely think it would be Ally McGraw, which would be interesting. Yeah, and she didn't necessarily have that hot of a career after Love Story either.
No.
I don't know. I feel like it's just like this cultural moment for Ally McGraw that happens here, but then beyond that, we don't see much from her.
No, that's unfortunately.
Yeah. I will suggest another movie here that you might have seen, you might not have, I don't know, but it is The Boys in the Band.
Yes.
Yes.
I have seen it. No. Yes is yes. I've seen it many, many times.
Cool.
I think it's a really terrifically directed version of the play. And the fact that they kept the original cast members was, I think, really noble. And these guys work together with each other so well. They were a well-oiled machine because they did it so often on stage. So when they got there, they just and because it played off Broadway, they didn't have to play to the second balcony. So their performances probably were already modified so that they would fit into film.
Yeah.
Particularly Cliff Gorman as Emery.
Oh yeah.
Yes, he is flamboyant. He is the Emery we all know, but it still works as a film.
Yeah.
I particularly like the opening titles when you got a real sense of New York in the late '60s. Going to Doubleday for your books, and it reflects each of the characters as we will come to know them later on. We see Hank playing basketball. We see Michael kind of walking around fashionably, and Cliff Gorman and his designer with his poodle. Before we even get to know them, that opening with Harper's Bazaar's version of Anything Goes really sets up the characters really well, so that by the time we meet them, we kind of know them already.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really love The Boys in the Band. I think it's definitely one of the first, if not the first, movie to establish many different gay characters and actually have them be differentiated from each other. We get actually some dimensionality to the gay male experience in New York at the time, which is surprisingly rare. Yeah. And the ensemble is fantastic. I don't even have like a total standout, but I love Leonard Fry. I love Kenneth Nelson, and yeah, definitely Cliff Gorman. They're all fantastic, and they bounce off each other so absolutely well. And you can obviously tell that it's based on a play because it's very stagey, but at the same time, it just feels really natural and almost improvisational. It's great, and it's a landmark movie. So,
yeah, it's interesting to see what has happened with The Boys in the Band, because when it opened, it was it was very provocative.
Mm-hmm.
And then there came a period of time when there was a backlash against it, and they said, "Oh, it's all stereotypes. It's the worst of gay life. Let's shove it back in the closet where it belongs." But now I think it's appreciated again, and not just because it captures a particular period, but the characters are very well developed. It's a really good piece of work,
mm-hmm.
And I'm glad the film exists.
Yeah, and I love I just love the two halves of the film, and how the first half really does set everything up for what's going to happen at the end, which is really a lot more dramatic.
And William Friedkin does a great job directing it.
Yeah.
You really, yes, you're aware it's a play, but you're never confined by it.
Mm-hmm. I mean, William Friedkin. This was the film he made before The French Connection, so he obviously came out of the gate in the 70s really strong. We have The Boys in the Band, The French Connection, The Exorcist. Like, this is a man who could do no wrong at this portion of his career. So yeah. Did you have another one for me?
There are a couple that got a few nominations, kind of an old-fashioned romantic comedy called Lovers and Other Strangers with Joseph Bologna. And at the same time, you'd have the old-fashioned thing. And then Fellini's Satyricon was out the same year, and Fellini wound up getting a directing nomination which was very impressive at the time. Bumping Out Airport. Oh.
And 5 Easy Pieces, for that matter.
And 5 Easy Pieces, for that matter. That's true, because Ken Russell got in for Women in Love instead.
Right, yeah.
So it is interesting that we mentioned Ryan's Daughter in passing. That's just the kind of film that they would have nominated in previous years by default. And they said, no. And I thought that was kind of a healthy rejection.
Yeah.
Even though John Mills did win playing a deaf mute in it, but that's an Oscar-y performance.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I can't say that I've seen Ryan's Daughter because I've heard not so great things about it, and it's also long, so that's two things that I don't love.
Yeah, long and not so hot put together, no thanks.
Yeah. I mean, I'll probably end up seeing it eventually, but I didn't feel a lot of urgency because I don't know if it really is relevant to the discussion of this year. But we did get a question about it from Gordon at Mark Wahlberg, who asked, how did Ryan's Daughter manage to pick up 2 major categories despite generally mixed to negative reviews upon its release?
Well, it was a big prestige film. It was MGM's big roadshow picture of the year, and they as I recall, their Oscar campaign tried to do the same thing that Fox did with Dr. Dolittle and Hello Dolly, and just try and strong arm it into the Oscar. And so that's where I think it got the 2. And John Mills is not a bad choice for supporting actor. I think I probably would have preferred Gene Hackman in I Never Sang for My Father, which is really a co-lead, but it's a creditable choice. I'm surprised it only got 2, given the reception at the time.
Yeah, I was reading an Inside Oscar about how they definitely had a big Oscar push for Ryan's Daughter. So I agree. I think they definitely tried to strong arm their way into the race, regardless of some of the mixed reviews. Just be like, hey, it's David Lean. Come on.
Yeah. Hey.
Another movie that comes out this year that's a pretty big deal is Woodstock. Documentary, of course, about the famous Woodstock Festival that happened the previous year. 3-hour-long documentary that is noteworthy, as our listener Ian Blocklock points out, because he says it is known as the most nominated documentary in Oscar history with 3 nominations. Do you think it had a chance of being the first doc to be a Best Picture nominee?
Yes, I think it could have. It had that cultural weight to it that other music docs didn't have. This was a phenomenon. The Woodstock gathering was a phenomenon at the time. And considering that what they had to film, it's extremely well done. You really do feel like you're there. And they didn't shy away from some of the darker elements of Woodstock, overdoses, things like that. Mm-hmm. It had gravitas to it, in addition to having some great songs. So I think if we had an expanded field, 8 or 9, I think it definitely could have gotten in.
I agree. Yeah. I mean, the fact that it gets into film editing is a big tell that it was probably being considered an actual Best Picture possibility for the great Thelma Schoonmaker. And then it was nominated for sound. So, I mean, I think it's a credible possibility of any doc that's ever been released. And like you said, it's such a cultural touch point that I feel like, it would have to be acknowledged as one of the best films of the year by also nature of the fact that it did very well at the box office at the same time. Yeah. So all of those factors, I think a definite yes on that one. Another war movie that comes out this year is Tora Tora Tora, as you alluded to earlier. And this is a movie about Pearl Harbor, and it tells both sides of the American side and the Japanese side of the war, kind of giving screen time and due diligence to both sides here, which I think is a credit to it that it does that and it balances them well. This was on TCM a few weeks ago, so I recorded it and watched it, and I think it's another one that's somewhat long and bloated at times, but still really impressive on a visual effects level. They use a lot of practical effects for the bombing and things like that, and the aerial scenes are great. So yeah, I think it's a solid film in this lineup of a lot of other war movies.
Yeah, it picked up 5 nominations, all the techie ones you would expect.
Mm-hmm.
And it was complicated. And it's the fact that it was so complicated probably helped MASH be ignored by 20th Century Fox. So I'm very glad Tor exists.
Yeah. The Aristocats, I'll just throw that out there. A Disney movie. Yeah. Very underrated. This is not an era that Disney is particularly well regarded for. This was kind of seen as a bit of a dark age at this moment, I think, but still a very fun movie that it's very clever. So just thought I'd throw that out there.
Might as well.
Yeah. And I have not seen The Landlord by Hal Ashby. I don't know if you have.
I have.
Okay. Well, we got a question about it, but you can share your thoughts now if you wish.
Yeah. I think it's very much a New York-y kind of film, at least sensibility, with a wonderful lead performance by Beau Bridges, with quite a number of African-American actors in it, and Lee Grant, who really warms that Lee Grant character up that she will finally cash in with Shampoo 5 years later. It's a movie that even at the time people said was underappreciated, and I think that nothing has done to change that. If you can remember it, but if you've seen it, you won't forget it.
Yeah, I love Hal Ashby's films, especially at this time, so I definitely think I would appreciate it. But just looking at them, this isn't actually really a question. This was just saying I think it's a wonderful film that needs to be talked about. So there you are. You just talked about it.
Thank you for the question.
Yes, that's taken care of. So that pretty much does it for the best movies that I can say deserved some more consideration. I don't know if you had others.
No, I think you covered them all.
Okay. One thing before we move on to our last segment is just to talk about how George C. Scott declines his Best Actor trophy this year, which we don't see things like that anymore. But, we did just talk 2 weeks ago about, of course, Marlon Brando and that whole incident with The Godfather. This was a sensibility, I think, that was rampant throughout the 70s and part of the late 60s, this feeling of the Oscars being kind of cheap and just an expensive sort of contest sort of thing that doesn't have much to do with artistic value, which people still say today, to be fair.
Yeah.
But at this time, it was very much something that was out in the open. And I think it was one of these things that would give some actors some sense of coolness or credibility to them to not care as much about it.
And there was outrage at the time. It's like, how dare he? We're giving him an Oscar. And he wasn't very politic in his explanation as to why. I have it exactly here. He said the Academy Awards were, quote, a 2-hour meat parade, a public display with contrived suspense for economic reasons. Well, okay. He has a reason.
Yeah. I think there's something to what he's saying. I think that's fair. I think that is a fair criticism. But at the same time, I was also reading an Inside Oscar about how he was giving like a lot of interviews at the time and, in a sense, virtually campaigning for himself while not actually saying that he wants the award. Like, he was very much out in the open publicly with things. So I don't know.
I could interpret that as him supporting the film.
Yeah, that's fair. And it just so happens that also helps him get some votes. Just saying.
Yeah. But it's interesting to note that Patton was released in the first week of February.
Mm-hmm.
And 10 days earlier, that's when MASH was released in January. So that, it didn't make a difference. Those were the final two. The way Cabaret and The Godfather were nominated so close together early in the year.
Yeah.
So how the Oscars have changed since then.
Oh my God. Yeah. Yeah, they would have saved all of these movies till like October to December, definitely.
Yeah.
It was now.
Part of it too is release patterns. I mean, back then you had to wait for a movie to come to your town. And now you get it the first time and the first day, and by 6 weeks in, you're sick of it. You don't even want to think about it for the Oscars. So it was a very different time then. So it's a little understandable why the calendar was more open to potential Oscar contenders opening at earlier parts of the year.
So when we come back, we will be delivering our verdict as to whether we think Patton deserved Best Picture or if MASH should have taken it.
The 5 nominees for the Best Picture in this, the 43rd year, display an equally wide range of content and approach, which is a healthy sign for both the movie makers and the moviegoers. The films are Love Story, produced by Howard G. Minsky. Airport, produced by Ross Hunter. Five Easy Pieces, produced by Bob Rafelson and Richard Wexler. Patton, produced by Frank McCarthy. MASH, produced by Ingo Preminger. May I have the envelope, please? There you are. Zooby-dooby-doo. The winner is Patton, Frank McCarthy.
And we are back. So now we will be delivering our verdict as to whether we think Patton deserved Best Picture or if MASH should have taken it. Tom O'Brien, what is your verdict?
I think that Patton is a classic Best Picture, but I think the times have been kinder in one sense to MASH because it did start a lot of the 70s ball rolling, and unkind to it in retrospect because of some of the treatment of women and the like. I would vote for it. That would be my favorite film of the year, but I would say Patton is a very understandable Best Picture winner.
Very good. Well, I will say that I was not necessarily anticipating this before I had watched MASH, but I think that I will say that I am good with Patton winning. That is what I would say. And it seems strange because of how much impact MASH had in many levels. But I think as a production and as a film, I find Patton to be more satisfying as a film. So there you have it, folks. Sorry. I mean, I know there's a lot of MASH fans out there, and Altman, of course, is very well regarded in film Twitter and things like that. But I just feel like Patton earned its win. Having said that, yeah, thank you. Having said that, I would have picked 5 Easy Pieces from this lineup, personally speaking. So that's that. And now I want to do something because this is the end of the 70s / the beginning of the 70s. And it will be the last 70s year that I cover here on this show. But I wanted to do a little wrap up because we got a few questions asking about just the decade as a whole, which is fantastic in many respects. Well, we can just get to one question that we got asking, would you say that the 70s are the greatest decade of Best Picture nominees?
I would say yes.
Yeah. I can't say that I've seen a lot of the earlier decade Best Picture nominees, but I can just say, based on what I've covered so far, Absolutely, yes. I think this is a decade full of so many classics that people still regard in high regard today. So I think it might have a few duds in between, but I think on the whole, there's so many classics here, that I can't say that anything else is better.
It's a decade in which its best films have really stood the test of time. They're not dated, they're not mawkish, they are challenging, and they still challenge to this day. And some of these films are absolutely still to this day my favorite.
Yeah,
I love them.
Totally agree. So I had a few questions come in that were a little more in depth, so I asked Tom before the show to maybe do a little bit of homework on this one. So this was from Gordon at Mark Wahlberg, who said, as a 70s general question, how would you rank the winners in each acting category for this decade? And then he said in parentheses, or if it's easier, just your top three. And that is what I decided to do, was the top three and not all of them, because that would take a long time. But I do have my top three in each category. I don't know if you have your top three as well, but
as do I. Let's
good.
See.
Excellent. Well, let's go through this one by one, starting with, how about Best Supporting Actor? Let's start there.
Okay.
My number three is Robert De Niro in The Godfather Part 2. Would you like to say your number three now?
Yes. My number three is Jason Robards in All the President's Men.
Very good one. My number two is Ben Johnson in The Last Picture Show.
Okay. And my number two is actually Robert De Niro in The Godfather Part 2.
Very good. And finally, my number one Best Supporting Actor winner of the decade is Joel Grey for Cabaret.
Shocking. My number one is Joel Grey for Cabaret.
How about that? We agree on something.
Yay!
We finally found something to agree on in this episode. So for for supporting actress, my number three. Look, I don't endorse category fraud, but it's a great performance regardless. My number three is Tatum O'Neal for Paper Moon.
Yeah, that is the kind of classic category fraud that makes it very difficult to get behind.
Yeah.
But you can't deny the performance.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just as a way of wanting to say here to the Academy for giving a comedy performance an Oscar. My number three is Maggie Smith in California Suite.
Nice. Good pick. My number two is Meryl Streep in Kramer versus Kramer.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
My number two would probably be Cloris Leachman in The Last Picture Show.
Very good. Well, my number one Best Supporting Actress of the 1970s is Cloris Leachman in The Last Picture Show. How about that?
Very good.
I talked about it last week. I think she's so goddamn good in The Last Picture Show. She is just brilliant.
She is.
Yeah.
And I'm going to go for a teeny tiny performance, the tiniest performance of all time.
Mm-hmm.
My number one is Beatrice Straight in Network.
Excellent. Excellent choice. Love it. So let's move on to Best Actor. This was a bit of a tough one for me to decide. But my number three is Marlon Brando in The Godfather.
A very, very good choice. My number three is Gene Hackman in The French Connection.
Excellent. My number two is Jack Nicholson in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Mm-hmm.
My number two is Marlon Brando in The Godfather.
And my number one Best Actor of the decade is Peter Finch in Network.
Love it. Yes. And I'm going to go with a very familiar name from this podcast, George C. Scott in Patton.
Very good. Can't go wrong there. So, Best Actress. Oh boy, here we go.
This one's a killer.
I love all these performances. Most of these performances. I won't say all.
Most of these winners are better than the men.
Yeah. Totally agree. My number 3. This came as a bit of a surprise to me, but just thinking about it felt right. My number 3 is actually Ellen Burstyn in Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore.
No, yeah, she's terrific in it.
Yeah.
Absolutely wonderful. A very layered performance.
Right. Yeah.
Very well deserved.
Mm-hmm.
My number 3 is Jane Fonda in Clute.
Love it. Love that performance too.
So good.
Yeah. My number 2 is Sally Field in Norma Ray. How about that?
A fave. Yeah. And my number 2 is another very familiar name, Glenda Jackson in Women in Love.
Ooh, very good. Well, my number 1 best actress of 1970s is Liza Minnelli in Cabaret. She does it all.
Well, I'll just show you then. Number 1 on my list is Liza Minnelli in Cabaret.
How about that? Apparently we agree on Cabaret here. And finally, we have Best Picture. So my number 3 Best Picture is Annie Hall.
Great. My number 3 is Annie Hall.
Well, isn't this awkward?
Yeah. No, great.
Okay, fine. My number 2 is The Godfather Part 2.
And my number 2 is The Godfather Part 2.
Oh, my Lord. Okay.
Oh, you obviously have a great mind.
Clearly. Great minds think alike. And my number 1 is The Godfather.
And my number 1 is The Godfather.
My goodness. Look at that, folks. I love it.
Something about the shock of that first film.
Yeah.
That I've never gotten. It just was such a surprise that, as complex as Godfather 2 is, there's something that I've always felt strongly towards the first one because it broke the mold. And it's probably the best film made from a bad book that I've ever seen in my life.
There you go. That just about sums it up right there. The other question we got was from Ronnie Castle, who asked us what the best movie was, the best male and female performances, both lead and supporting, basically everything we just went through. Our favorite ones from those that were not nominated for Oscars in the 1970s.
Curse you, Ronnie. What a question.
Yeah, this took a little bit to figure out my absolute favorite in both category. In all categories, I should say. So I can kick things off by saying my best supporting actor who did not get a nomination was John Cazale in The Godfather Part 2.
That's a great choice. That really is absolutely terrific.
And I will also add an addendum to say John Cazale in anything he did in the 1970s because he was never nominated and he should have been.
He should have been, and he made only great films.
Yeah, only Best Picture quality films. Yeah.
My supporting actor is in a decade filled with great performances from him. I would say Robert Duvall in Network.
Ooh, good one.
He is just a shark. I love it.
Another great Robert Duvall performance. Yep. So I struggled with Best Supporting Actress, to be honest, to find someone, but ultimately I went for someone from the film Cries and Whispers. And this person is not necessarily someone who is a total supporting character, but I just figured since she was nominated at the BAFTAs for Best Supporting Actress that I'll just place her here. And that is Ingrid Thulin for Cries and Whispers.
I do remember her. And a tip of the hat to you for remembering her, too.
Thank you.
My best non-nominated supporting actress is Barbara Harris in Nashville.
Oh my God. I totally forgot about that. Yes, that's a great one.
Yeah, it's just always, desperate for a break, always in the wrong place at the wrong time until she finally is in the right place at the right time in that famous last scene.
Yeah.
And it's an extraordinary bit of work. And granted, there were a lot of Nashville contenders in this particular category, with 2 being nominated, but I wish they had made a place for Barbara Harris.
Yeah, that's such a good choice. God, I forgot about that. But thank you for the reminder. My best actor choice is going to be Gene Hackman for The Conversation.
Another great choice. That's a really good, and again, very different for him. Being kind of a schlub.
Right.
He never plays something like that, and that was a memorable characterization.
Yeah, he's so good in it. Yeah.
My choice for best nominated best actor, I'm going to go with Jon Voight in Deliverance.
Oh wow, nice. Excellent.
As the film goes on and the panic sets in, you see it all in his face, and it's not a film that is easy to sit through, but he's really good in it, and I think that performance led to his, accompanied with Midnight Cowboy, his later work as well, and becoming a very, 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 very fine actor in the 70s.
Excellent choice. Well, my best actress choice is Ruth Gordon for Harold and Maude. I talked about her last week. She is so iconic in that movie for me. So I love her.
And my choice for best nominated best actress, I'm going to go for Julie Christie in Shampoo.
Ah, very good.
There is a scene where Warren Beatty forgets her name deliberately, chooses to forget her name because he's introducing her to another woman. And under her breath, she just growls, "My name is Jackie Sean." And I've never seen that from Julie Christie before. And it's something I've always remembered from the 1970s.
I love that. Okay, so my choice, this was super hard to figure out a movie of the 70s to say was the most snubbed, in my opinion, but I just went with a movie that actually was probably close to being nominated at the end of the day, and a movie that I love, and that is Close Encounters of the Third Kind.
What an astute choice. My number one is Close Encounters of the Third Kind.
Oh my God. Wow.
It's baffling to this day that, people had, they just assume it got nominated, but they voted in Julia and The Goodbye Girl over Close Encounters of the Third Kind.
Yep. And well, the Star Wars factor probably didn't help it.
Probably.
But too much overlap.
That's a film that's aged very well.
It's fantastic.
And I think probably one of the most egregious Best Picture snubs ever.
Yeah, I would say so. I think it gets like 8 nominations, but not Best Picture. Absurd. Absolutely absurd. And it very much deserved it. Yeah.
But what a decade this has been. I mean, even the non-nominated ones we've had a bunch of great performances mentioned.
Yeah. So I love the 70s. I'm sad to be leaving. Happy to be entering an interesting decade of the 60s, which has a lot of different kinds of films. Well, there's still some of the new Hollywood is starting to come up in the 60s. So we're going to start to see the origins of a lot of what I've already talked about on this show. In addition to a whole bunch of musicals. So strap in, folks. It's going to be fun.
This is going to be a blast.
Yes. So thank you again, Tom, for doing this and also going above and beyond to help me conclude the 70s in style.
My pleasure. Anytime. Thank you very much, Kevin.
Yes. So tell the people where they can find you on the internet.
Well, you can find me, my film articles at goldderby.com. You can find my film reviews and podcasts at nextbestpicture.com. And my primary review site is exactchangetoday.com. And you can find me on Twitter at Thomas E. O'Brien.
Excellent. You got it down pat now. I love it. So you can find me on Twitter at Kevin_Jacobson. The podcast is at Oscar Runner Up. The show is on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Google Play, and now on Spotify. How about that? Yes. So if any Spotify listeners, you can now listen at work. So be sure to rate, review, and subscribe. And now I will leave it up to you listening at home to decide whether you think Patton deserved Best Picture or if MASH should have taken it. And you can do that by voting at my website at filmtrophies.com or emailing me at filmtrophies@gmail.com. So once again, thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Tim.
And I will bid you all adieu.